Marco reluctantly left his slick, self-built liquid-cooled gaming PC, called Cyberpussy, and his messy twilight-darkened boy room, after a long night of intense cola-amplified hacking and elaborate, caffeine-induced planning of an elaborate denialist service, DOS attack. An attack against a bank website. It was a target he had chosen at pure random, at the roll of a digital dice, to test his rising programming prowess. Well, a roll of dice was perhaps an oversimplification. He had built a random number generator that selected a website on the net from certain criteria. Marco was more than eager to try out his growing power of extreme coding and well-trained computer muscles. Up until now, he had only hacked small business websites and other more harmless targets, nothing major and nothing all that important. Marco's hacking had also been somewhat innocent, planting pranks like farting monsters on corporate websites, and other embarrassing contraptions usually related to porn. This, however, was different, excitingly so, an adrenaline kick like an arrow straight through the heart. It was like if a lightning bolt had hit Marco smack on, energizing him, making him feel more alive than he ever had before. But what Marco did was also strictly illegal. This was no mere prank, this was an all-out attack on a bank website on the net, and he also had a more nefarious purpose in mind. The initial attack, annoying as it might be, was only a test, a way to aggressively probe the bank's digital outer defenses, to see what could be done in the future to get inside. The DOS attack would gather valuable intel that could be used to plan out more elaborate digital attacks, such as planting ransomware, trojans, and viruses. He was already a steady visitor on Darknet and all the other shady back alleys of the internet, hanging out on chats and forums of the more nefarious kind, slowly drifting into the embrace of the unlawful and vicious, more and more catering to the darker tendencies of the yearnings of his soul. Marco sometimes resented the world so much that his mind grew hateful and dark. He wanted to hurt someone during these brief but intense moments, but not hurt them physically, no, but digitally. His perceived adversaries were not so much physical persons as corporations or the systems of society itself. The institutions and backbone that made up the country he lived in as well as the global systems, such as banking, corporations, and organizations. Sometimes he longed for chaos, well, perhaps not chaos, but change. Despite technology, progress hadn't really changed the nature of humanity. The violence and hate were still there. The modern age had merely muted the darker tendencies of human behavior. The world was basically as it always had been. Well, to be fair, the system, society, was not always his enemy. Sometimes he wanted the opposite, to find and put cyber criminals to justice. When ransomware, Trojan or viruses was used against hospitals, he felt bad. It was one thing to target the fat, greedy banks, but to put lives at stake like that was an abomination, a pure act of evil if ever there was one. Marco sometimes imagined himself fighting crime, working for the police or CSI. His mind was painfully split between these two extremes of light and darkness, and he wandered the razor-sharp edge of these opposite, but different worlds. Marco had always been a thrill-seeker, and nothing thrilled him more than hacking, to do what others didn't do, to push further than he thought he could, like his planned bank attack. It was so close now, he had nicknamed it the Big Cyber Heist, like he was a bank robber out of an old Western movie. Marco had prepared everything thoroughly, imagining himself as a master criminal plotting the perfect crime. All preparations were in order, yes, all he had to do now was to just press a button on the screen, and the attack would start. It was so tempting. Marco would have pushed it already if he hadn't needed to go to the bathroom to unload his overfull ladder. He desperately needed to pee. Marco didn't dare to press the button and not be in front of the computer. He wanted to watch every moment of the attack. Marco therefore reluctantly took a much-needed break from his bright red gaming chair, and went downstairs to the main bathroom located in the little corridor between the kitchen and the living room. As Marco pressed the light, the room slowly lit up, the fluorescent lamp flickering several times before finally deciding to stay lit. Like so much else in the house, it needed changing. Marco stumbled over to the toilet and quickly relieved his bladder, slowly lifting his head and seeing himself in the dim and distorted reflections from the mirror over the sink. As he did, the lamp began to flicker again, as if it wanted to hide that hideous face in the mirror. It slowly lit up again. Marco looked at that face, a face he barely recognized. He didn't like what he saw, that pale face that barely ever saw the sun. That rugged hair that should have been cut a long time ago. He watched his sickly eyes in the flickering light, those blank dots in a face as white and pale as the color tone of the bathroom. Not that it was all that clean, the porcelain hardly covered with dirt like the rest of the house. It had seen better days. Marco briefly looked away, wanting to run from the reflected apparition, the monster version of himself. That zombie-like thing he had somehow become, deprived of sufficient sleep, intoxicated on caffeine and high on too much sugar. Marco hastily washed his hands in the dirty sink, wiping them sloppily on the dirty towel. He was about to leave when he suddenly froze. Marco had again caught a glimpse of his own reflection, although that was not what troubled him this time. It was what he saw in the mirror, a message written. And toothpaste was scribbled on the glass. Marco swore it hadn't been there a second ago. Yet, it couldn't have magically appeared, could it? The note simply said, "Don't do it." What? Marco thought, suddenly afraid, the heart now drumming fast in his breast. He knew he was alone in the house, or was he? What if the police or the FBI was after him? They could theoretically have found him through his earlier hacking attempts. But the authorities wouldn't leave a message on the bathroom mirror. That didn't make any sense. So, Marco silently and stealthily left the bathroom and carefully scouted the boundaries of the living room. It looked as messy and dirty as it always did, despite his mother's relentless cleaning. The only place she cleaned, the room contained nothing out of the ordinary. No police or men in black suits and menacing ties suddenly stormed in through the front door to catch him. No shadows that moved to the sound of running footsteps. Nevertheless, Marco knew something was amiss. He crouched down and slowly crawled over the floor in military style, making his way past the black but worn leather couch with the big scratch markings from a now dead and buried cat to the white framed window that overlooked the front porch and the street beyond. Marco half expected to see a discreet but suspicious van parked outside, but he saw nothing like that. The street was almost empty and somehow felt devoid of life, as if it was nothing more than a painted picture. The neighbor's house on the other side of the street was lit, and he saw movement in the kitchen. But that was it. Marco slowly allowed himself to relax. No, allowed was the wrong word, forcing was more accurate. Marco tried desperately to think clearly, keeping the panic at bay. It wasn't easy. The whole situation had gotten Marco spooked. He couldn't explain the text in the bathroom, but at least nothing stranger had happened. Marco began to ponder if it had all been a hallucination. After all, he had been up a long time, and lack of sleep could make you see things. Surely it must have been a hallucination brought on by too little sleep. Marco went back to the bathroom and looked again in. The mirror.the text was still there. A very persistent hallucination. Marco took some paper and cleaned the mirror until nothing of the toothpaste remained. Feeling somewhat calmer after the text was gone, he half expected to suddenly find more words magically appearing. The mirror, but nothing more happened. Marco just stood there, dumbfounded, again staring at his own pale face. It was a strange feeling. He didn't remember looking this. What was the word? Sick. Marco had lost tracks of days. If it weren't for the computer, he wouldn't know what the time was. It somehow felt like his brother had died just a few days ago, but it had been years now. Marco almost thought he could see Orlando's reflection in the mirror. Almost. Then, suddenly the text he had just erased was back. The toothpaste text had reappeared. HOW. Fear rocked his mind. Marco stretched out his hand to touch the blurry toothpaste. He then tasted it. It felt real, too real to be a hallucination induced by a sleep-deprived mind. Real. Indeed, this was the second time it had appeared. It was a strange, weird, creepy. Marco washed the toothpaste from his hands and cleaned the mirror a second time. He then went up the creaky stairs and slowly loomed back to his own room, carefully closing the door behind him. His eyes reluctantly fell upon some old photos on a nearby shelf. Pictures of when he had been younger. He could only vaguely recall the moments on the photos. They felt like a dream. But the two boys in the pictures looked happy. His eyes fell on one photo. It was a nicely framed photo of him and his brother, Orlando. They had been best friends once before Orlando died in that terrible and senseless car accident. The car had run over him on the street, twice, in front of the house, and then bolted off. It had been terrible for Marco, as if a part from his own body had been severed. He remembered that the car had been red, and he remembered catching a short glimpse of the driver's face, a face he knew he would recognize if he ever saw it again. But he never did. Marco had walked the streets many times without ever seeing that face again, and each day when he looked out from the window of his room, he saw the street that had claimed his brother's life. Marco had spent days at the window, gradually drifting into a dark and dangerous mindset, where twilight thoughts sailed like black ships through his brain. He had withdrawn from the world then, left the few friends he knew, and spent most of his time inside the confines of his own room, coding away day and night on his computer until there was nothing else that mattered, forgetting even time. The room was like a coffin. And it had been that way since Orlando died. Marco had also grown pale like a vampire, avoiding the sun because it reminded him of the world outside. He carefully put the photo back on the shelf and returned to the bluish tint of the computer screen. Marco hadn't decided yet if he would carry out the denial of service attack or not. Everything was prepared, yet he hesitated, not knowing what held him back. Although it might be the text that had appeared on the bathroom mirror. Yeah, definitely that. He suddenly saw a message on the screen. "We're watching you." Marco froze again, quickly and nervously looking around. He quickly paced over to the window and carefully peered between the black curtains, catching a glimpse of the cars beyond a neglected and partially overgrown front yard. There was, as before, nothing out of the ordinary on this street. No surveillance van or suspicious-looking car. No police cars with blinking lights either. Could it be some sort of elaborate joke? Had he been hacked? Puzzled, but intrigued, Marco sat down in front of the computer and typed a line at the open window. "Who are you?" Marco waited, not really thinking an answer would come, but it did. "Do you want to know who we are?" Marco didn't understand, yet the text kept appearing on the screen. It was nothing more than words, and yet he typed, "Yes." Almost immediately an answer came. "Are you sure?" Marco typed yes again with sweaty hands. He had to know, waiting a half minute before finally pressing enter. A few minutes passed. Then something impossible happened. The computer screen seemed to stretch out like some sort of distorted virtual reality experience, or perhaps an LSD-induced trip gone horribly wrong. A shit scared Marco tried desperately to back off, to flee, but he was too slow and was sucked into the impossible digital vortex that poured out from the monitor and devoured him. Then everything went from bright white to pitch black. A voice spoke to him in the darkness. "Marco, fucker." Marco's vision slowly returned, as the white light appeared again, and the blurry haze in front of his eyes focused on a coherent image. He could see an entirely white room with an almost invisible white door as the only exit. It didn't have any furniture except for 2 chairs made of glass. It was impossible to see where the light that lit the room came from. A man sat in one of the chairs. He wore